Jayant Davar also joining us now of Sandhar Tech to discuss the opportunity for Atmanirbhar Bharat when it comes to the auto component space. Jayant, in a recent interview, Mr. Bhargav of Maruti, in fact, talking to us about how electronic parts have been the biggest handicap for the auto industry. Why has India not been able to develop this potential itself? We still rely quite heavily on importing these parts. What are some of the reasons behind that, and do you see that changing?
To be honest, I think electronics and its subparts. I hope you can hear me. The ecosystem needs to be there. So, a lot of us talk about China, China. But the fact is that electronics as an ecosystem of scale was built in China like nowhere else in the world. And therefore, for all electronics for the world, whether it was electronics that had to do with consumer electronics, whether it had to do with auto electronics, whether it had to do with any other kind of electronics, whether it was PCB manufacture, whether it was semiconductor manufacturing, whether it was any of those that need a lot of scale and huge levels of investment. China did take that call, moved in ahead, and became the world leader in that sense. In India, I think the scales were not there. And therefore, when we talk about Atmanirbhar today, there are a number of things that are kind of coinciding together now. One is, of course, Atmanirbhar and the sentiment. The second is the world kind of saying, let's not be too dependent on China and look at other options. And India comes up as an option where there is also consumer demand for all these products. And therefore, it is time for us to take that leap, get into that particular mode, to take on from where we should have a long time ago, but we didn't, but it's not too late. So I think the call for Atmanirbhar is very, very timely in that sense.
Okay. So a timely call, of course. How can the government help incentivize things? As you said, it's about creating an ecosystem. What are some of the challenges? Where do you feel the solutions lie?
In terms of how the auto electronics works, the auto electronics have now become an inherent part and an integral part of every auto that's built in India and overseas. We have moved up that value chain where more electronics go into a vehicle. However, having said that, we still don't have the volumes call for us to be able to do that large scale of manufacturing, which in turn means that the cost of manufacturing for auto electronics in the country is still going to be more than probably what it is in China. And therefore, you would need the auto companies to come together to be able to pay more to the auto component guys, for the government to come in terms of policy, in terms of making sure that there are some benefits and incentives in terms of import of this equipment, if that could be the case. So I think in this entire scenario, the entire triad has to work together. The auto component makers to take the initiative to carry this agenda forward, the auto companies or the OEMs to come up and say, well, we will make sure that the support is there for the auto component guys, and it's not going to be just like-to-like comparison for some period of time while volumes build up. And obviously, the government has to create that ecosystem for imports, incentives. For example, the government has come forward. There was an MSIP scheme which came about, and now there is another scheme that's just been brought into focus for auto electronics in the country. I think a lot of that is starting to happen. But if all three of these stakeholders could work together in the long term, we would definitely become the envy of the world. We have the possibility and the potential to.
Sure. Just on the point that you're making right now, will OEMs and other partners be willing to pay that premium price for, buying locally made, or for that matter, source parts as well? What I'm trying to get at is, how exactly can the industry attempt to bring down the costs and make it economically viable?
Well, volumes are a huge portion of this entire thing. The thing is now to have shared platforms in India. So if all the OEMs, for example, come together and they say that we are going to commonize a lot of parts, obviously that adds to the volume, nature, and scale of what could be done in India. If the government was to come together and say, well, these are certain standards that we will have in electronics for the country for a period of time, all of that kind of builds up to scale. Effectively, the price or the cost of manufacturing and supply is a huge factor of the ecosystem in place and scale. So I do believe that with the sentiment going away, and I'm not only talking here, of course, India is the Atmanirbhar scheme, but I see a lot of Western Europe and the US today looking to do exactly that. We operate out of Europe as well. And in recent times, we've been given a lot of orders, in fact, advances, very quick moments, and in fact, opportunities to put up new plants for alternating the supply lines from China into Europe and into the United States. If those guys are taking those full steps, you can imagine the kind of sentiment that lies around the world. And therefore, India is another opportunity where we can not only use, consume, but also build. And therefore, we cannot miss this particular opportunity. All of us have to act together, behave together, act together. And if there is pain of cost for the short run, we all have to sit down and bear it.
Can the government in any way incentivize?
They are incentivizing. There are some schemes, but I think that needs to be aggressively moved up to the next orbit in terms of more incentivization that needs to be done. However, there are schemes. They are still a little bureaucratic in nature. They are taking time for things to come across. There are dates attached to saying, well, this has to start by April of this year. If it doesn't, then this whole scheme is taken off. I think a longer term perspective to say, well, whatever happens in the next 3 years towards this, in case all of that could be looked at under these schemes, it'll go a long way in bringing up confidence of people to come up and say, well, I'm going to manufacture in India, and this is the place to go forward.
Okay, good speaking with you and good to get in all that perspective on how the industry can become Atmanirbhar or self-reliant.